Thank you everyone for coming tonight. Let me introduce to you Larry McClure with the Tualatin Historical Society, our Lower Columbia chapter of the Ice Age Floods Institute, shares our meetings, and we are very excited to do that. So Larry McClure, would you please introduce our speaker tonight?
Well, I certainly am glad to. I'd like to have you all meet Dr. Althea Rizzo, who has a distinguished career in geology and the implications for us all. We're lucky to have someone like Althea in our state, but the same information she shares tonight is worthwhile everywhere in our Northwest region, all the way down to California, because it's part of a new technology system now that she will explain a little later called ShakeAlert. But she brings many years of experience in this field of geologic hazards and how to be ready. I was interested in her bio that she did spend some time even in suicide, in charge of getting ready for a tsunami if that were to occur again. There have been others in the past over the centuries, but I'm sure that she worries about the coastal regions of our state as well as us on this side of the Cascade Range. So let me just say, welcome, Althea Rizzo. We're glad to have you here. And take it away, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for that introduction, and also for the invitation to come speak to your group tonight. I grew up in Pasco, Washington, so not very far from the channeled scablands. So I spent a lot of time up there when I was much younger, playing around the potholes and loose falls and that kind of area. So again, thank you for inviting me here tonight to talk about Cascadia and some of the preparedness you're doing for it. Feel free to write questions into the chat. I believe Sylvia is going to be monitoring those, and we will have a Q&A at the end of my talk. So I probably don't have to spend a lot of time describing what Cascadia is for this group, but I thought that I would kind of run through a really brief primer of what Cascadia is and what we can expect from the next Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. So the Cascadia subduction earthquake, let me try that one again. The Cascadia subduction zone runs from Northern California all the way up to the northern end of Vancouver Island in British Columbia. It's about 600 miles long. So when this thing happens, and if it is the full RIP 9, it will impact Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. And then the tsunami will cross and affect Alaska, Hawaii, and Japan, and some of the Asian states. We know that these subduction zones create some of the largest earthquakes in the world. Anytime you see about a 9.0 or higher, you know it's a subduction zone, because it just takes these very large fault structures to create very large earthquakes. And what we can see for Cascadia is what we saw in Sumatra in 2004, and then Japan in 2011. Our subduction zones are very similar in size and impact. The one main difference between the Cascadia subduction zone and some of these other subduction zones that have had earthquakes recently is that our subduction zone is unusually quiet for a subduction zone. And in fact, up until about the mid-1980s, they didn't think that the Cascadia subduction zone was actually an active fault and capable of producing these earthquakes. But we know that they are tied to the 1700 orphan tsunami that happened in Japan. So we do know that the last one happened on January 26th around 9 p.m. in the year 1700. So it's been about 321 years since the last Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. And the most frequent question that people want to know is, when is the next one going to happen? And the answer is well, we can't really predict earthquakes no matter what you read on the internet. But what we can do is look into the past and see what has happened before. And recent studies by Chris Goldfinger and some other people show that we have about 41 of these earthquakes in the last 10,000 years. And the interval between the earthquakes is as short as 150 years. It's also as large as 1,000 years. When we start to look at, how often they happen, about every 300 to 500 years for a full magnitude 9 rupture. What you're seeing on the screen now at the top is a time scale. And you can see that we've had a number of these earthquakes over the last 10,000 years, and they're fairly spread out. They're not all clustered together. In fact, we don't have a large enough sample to say whether or not these earthquakes do cluster. But what you'll notice is that we've had a pretty good gap since the last one. And while the last one was a 9.0 earthquake, we don't know that the next one will be a 9.0 earthquake. About half of those earthquakes in the last 10,000 years have been the full rupture of a 9.0 earthquake. The other half of the time, it was a partial rupture. And you can see that this lower slide by Chris Goldfinger shows different types of intervals depending on how much of the rupture is happening. And even a small earthquake is a 7.6. And so that's still a very large earthquake. It won't be as impactful for the region as a 9.0 earthquake, but it will be a very bad day for whatever section of the coast is directly opposite of the rupture zone. So we don't know when the next one is going to happen. Looking at partial ruptures, there is about a 40% chance in the next 50 years that that will happen. But the thing to remember is that clock started back in 2012 when that study was produced. So we're well within, we're 9 years into that 50-year possibility. So a lot of people like to say that Cascadia is overdue, but that's kind of looking at it wrong. We're just simply in the window that it becomes much more likely every single day. So we don't know when the next one is going to be. We don't know how big the next one is going to be. We just know that there will be a next one, probably sooner rather than later, and probably bigger than we want to see here in the Pacific Northwest. What we want to really think about with Cascadia is, what are the impacts to the Pacific Northwest, and how can we start to mitigate some of those effects? And so we'll just talk here a little bit about the different effects of these large earthquakes. And the first one is a strong ground shaking. And the thing to remember here is that our built environment can really influence how well we are able to recover from a very large seismic event. Here on this slide, at the bottom of the slide, we see two different earthquakes. On the left, we have Haiti. 2010, it had a 7.0 earthquake, and it basically just destroyed that region of the country around the capital. 250,000 people died in the earthquake, and another 80 to 100,000 people died from the secondary disaster of disease. So on the right, we have Japan that had the 9.0 earthquake back in 2011. Now we had about 15 to 20,000 people die, but 95% of the people who died from that event died from drowning from the tsunami. So Japan has spent the last 50 years basically rebuilding its infrastructure, rebuilding its built environment to be able to withstand these kinds of earthquakes. And outside of the tsunami zone, there was very little damage, and they were pretty much back up and running in a few weeks. They're still building in the tsunami zone, and there's some earthquake damage that they're still building on. But for the most part, the utilities, their telecommunications, their transportation systems were back up in about 2 to 3 weeks. We're nowhere near that here in the Pacific Northwest. Like I said, we didn't know that Cascadia was capable of these large earthquakes until about 1985. We started learning more about it. So we're kind of behind the curve when it comes to mitigating for this very large event. one of the things that, we're concerned about is how strong that shaking intensity is going to be. I picked this map here for Hood River to show that even east of the Cascades, we can expect fairly strong shaking. And in some places, if it's soft, unconsolidated soils like around the river and alluvial soils like that, we can expect strong, very strong to even severe shaking. So even very far away from the subduction zone, we can expect a fairly robust amount of shaking. And this is what we really need to start preparing for and mitigating for. If nothing that, if we have learned nothing else from this last year, we've learned that our supply chains are very fragile. And it won't take much to disrupt our ability to get goods and services into the Pacific Northwest after a Cascadia subduction zone. Because remember, if it's a 9.0 earthquake, Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia are all going to be impacted from this. Another one of the hazards that we have from these very large events are landslides. Landslides are fairly common here in Oregon. We get a big rain, someone in Portland sneezes, and the West Hills have a whole bunch of landslides. And this is really important because Oregon has a lot of landslide prone areas. Again, this is out in Hood River County. And you can see that there is a lot of land that is very susceptible to landslides. And this is an impact to our transportation systems mostly. And this is one of the reasons why after Cascadia happens, if it's a 9.0 especially, we can expect for it to take 3 to 5 years for the east-west routes between I-5 and 101 to be restored for regular types of traffic. And this is something that ODOT is working on. They have identified a 50-year plan for how to mitigate key routes for dealing with landslides, with liquefaction, and some of the other hazards. But it just takes time to mitigate for these very large events, especially since we're kind of late to the game. Another one of the hazards that we are going to be dealing with is liquefaction. This is where you have sandy and consolidated soils that get saturated. And then during the earthquake, they basically turn to pudding. And buildings don't sit very well on pudding. They have a tendency to slide around. They can settle unevenly. But the really big impact from liquefaction is to our underground utilities. And that's where we have water. That's where we have natural gas, where we have telecommunications. And so we can expect to see fairly widespread disruption of utilities and telecommunications and water and sewer and that kind of thing. In fact, after the Christchurch earthquake, there were some of the residential areas that were without water and sewer for over 2 years. And so they were using porta potties for 2 years in some of these residential areas. And then other areas, they just basically returned to Greenway because they just couldn't afford to mitigate for the liquefaction. And again, this is from Hood River County, and you can see that there are lots of areas that are also susceptible to liquefaction. We have a tendency to build our communities near rivers because that's where transportation and fresh water were, but that's also very often poor soils or even engineered soils that were created. And of course, after the earthquake, we can expect to see the tsunami. And the tsunami is probably going to be the main cause for death from a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. We just won't see the numbers of people dying from the earthquake that we will for the tsunami. And the tsunami arrives about 15 to 20 minutes later on the open beach after the shaking starts. If you're down at Cape Blanco, it's about 8 minutes because we were at the closest point to the subduction zone there. And what this means is that if you feel the ground shaking, you need to get to high ground as soon as possible. You don't wait for anyone to tell you to evacuate. You want to know that you've felt the earthquake and get to high ground as soon as possible. And we can expect to see exactly what happened in 2004 in the Indonesian area, on the Indian Ocean area, and then across to Africa, what we saw, what we can expect to see here in the Pacific Northwest. But when it comes to tsunamis, it's really important to distinguish between local tsunami, the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, and distant tsunami, because we don't want people reacting to distant tsunamis in the same way they react to a local tsunami. A local tsunami, you're going to have no warning except for the earthquake, because it's literally offshore. But for a distant tsunami, that is coming from elsewhere. That is coming from, you know, Alaska or Japan or the Kuril Islands or Chile. There's a number of places that can send distant tsunamis towards our shores. But as we saw in 2011, you know, it took 10 hours to get here from Japan. And we did have some damage on the south coast. But for the most part, distant tsunamis don't cause a lot of damage. But we want to make sure that, you know, people just know that all they have to do is get away from the beaches and the ocean in order to get to safety. They can go to a cafe up the hill and kind of wait it out. But it's the local tsunami that we're most concerned about. And then, of course, the aftershocks. It takes centuries to build up this stress, and it's not going to be released in a single earthquake. And so we can expect hundreds, if not thousands, of aftershocks after the originating earthquake. We might even see some foreshocks for it. And the thing to remember here is that some of these large earthquakes can possibly get as high as a 7, as high as an 8, and also cause another tsunami from that aftershock. And sometimes it's the aftershocks that actually bring buildings down because they are damaged in the first main shock, and then it takes an aftershock to actually cause that building to come down. So those are the main hazards that we are going to be looking at from a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. And so when we look at what this means for Oregon is that, you know, it's really going to change the way we live. And while it might not be Mad Max Thunderdome, even though I would totally rock that outfit, it's really going to change the way we live here in the Pacific Northwest. So we know that Oregon is at risk from this earthquake and tsunami that's going to significantly impact our people and economy for decades. We only need to look at Japan to know that even a highly prepared country like Japan is still rebuilding a decade later from that tsunami. So we know that it is probably going to take us longer because we are not nearly as prepared as the Japanese are. So when we're looking at Cascadia and planning for Cascadia, we have certain assumptions that we work with. We know that there's going to be 3 metropolitan cities in the impact zone. We know that about 15 million people live in the impact zone and will have no power for weeks to months to years, depending on where you are and how big the earthquake is. There's going to be no fuel for weeks to months to years. Oregon gets about 90% of its liquid fuel from refineries north of Seattle, and it comes to Oregon in a single pipeline. That pipeline crosses 15 rivers. And then it goes into the Port of Portland, which was built in the 1910s and the 1920s. So we have, you know, a lot of vulnerabilities in our built environment. You know, as we saw in this last year, deliveries of food and water can be disrupted very easily. So we can expect also areas to have no running water, no sewer for weeks to months to years after this. The more we prepared for this, the more we mitigate our built environment. We spend money on infrastructure. We can take it from years to months. And if we spend more money and work on more mitigation, we can take it from months to weeks. It's just going to take a lot of work to basically mitigate our entire infrastructure system. And one of the reasons is most of the buildings in the built environment that we have here in Oregon was built before we even had seismic building codes here in Oregon. We, look at all those beautiful bridges on Highway 101 over on the coast. And, those bridges were built in the 1920s and 1930s. And most of our schools, our hospitals, our fire stations, a lot of the civic infrastructure that we're going to rely on after this was built before we had seismic building codes. And then the thing to remember about building codes is it just goes to life safety. That does not mean you can use the building or structure after the earthquake. You have to build to better than code if you want to be able to use it after an earthquake. Looking at our transportation systems, we can expect about 600 bridges to be heavily damaged, for about 400 to be totally or partially collapsed. The routes connecting Interstate 5 and 101 will be down for months to years. Restoration time could take, 3 to 5 years. It's just going to take time to retrofit all of these bridges, and we hope Mother Nature gives us that time. But the thing to remember is that it doesn't take a structural collapse to cause injury or to cause disruption. Hospitals are a perfect example of this. You can have the structure still standing, but if the non-structural pieces, the oxygen, the water, all of the interior spaces, if those are not also mitigated to be able to withstand the earthquake, you're not going to be able to use that building afterwards. So it's really important that we take the time to look at our built environment, invest in that infrastructure, and make sure that when we are prepared for this. And so we know how to mitigate for seismic issues. We have lots of different ways to do it. Utah put their entire Capitol building on base isolation. So it's basically sitting on Great Big Springs, so that when they have a basin and range earthquake down there, their Capitol building will be able to withstand that earthquake. So we know how to engineer these very big projects. What we don't have very often is new technology coming along to help us out. And that's what we have here with ShakeAlert. This is brand new technology. They've been working on ShakeAlert for about 10, 15 years. And we just launched it here in Oregon earlier this year. We launched it on March 11th, which was the 10th anniversary of the Japanese event. And what this is a system that will send out a very rapid message to let you know that shaking has started somewhere. It's not a predictive system. We can't predict earthquakes. Like I said, this is, once the earthquake has started, it will very rapidly inform that shaking will be arriving soon. So, like I said, ShakeAlert is an early warning system. It's not a prediction. And how many seconds of warning you get, it really depends. It depends on how close you are to the epicenter or the rupture. So we know that we're going to have these very large earthquakes. So it's really important for Oregonians to be prepared for the big one and for also the smaller crustal events that could sometimes be more impactful to communities than the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, depending on where it is and how close it is to the community. So looking at ShakeAlert and how it works, we have the earthquake, we have the fault zone under stress, and eventually that earthquake happens. And then what happens is that is quickly registered by the system of seismic networks. Oregon and the Pacific states have invested a lot of money over the last 3 to 5 years in improving our seismic detection network. It was pretty sparse about 5 years ago. We didn't have a very robust network here in Oregon, but we are now building out to a very strong system that can give us a lot of good accuracy when it comes to delivering these types of alerts. So you could have seconds of warnings, you could have tens of seconds of warnings, but we won't know until the earthquake actually starts. And this is the kind of earthquakes we can expect to see here in the Pacific Northwest, of course, the subduction zone, but that's not the only kind of earthquake that we get. We also get crustal earthquakes, 1993 Cay Falls, Scotts Mills. We've had some crustal faults over in Eastern Oregon in the early 1930s, 1940s era. But we also get deep earthquakes, deep intraplate earthquakes. The Nisqually 2001 event was a deep intraplate earthquake. So it's not just subduction zones that we have to worry about here in Oregon. So just to kind of reiterate, ShakeAlert's not a prediction system. How many seconds of warning you get, well, it depends. An Oregonian should be prepared for either the big one or the smaller but still damaging earthquakes. So what can you do with these few seconds of warnings? And this is where ShakeAlert really comes into play, and its greatest strength is that you can automate systems. Currently we have eWeb down in Eugene that is automating its water system so that if an earthquake happens, they won't lose all of that water. When the signal goes out, it can be picked up by an automated system, and then that system can do an action. And so for eWeb, that action is closing the valves so they don't lose the water that's in the reservoir, or if it's at the treatment plant, they don't lose clean water, or they don't release sewer water out into the rivers and into the open. So automation is really where it's strongest. And so some of the things that people are doing is, like I said, local PUDs are looking at it to contain the water, either clean or dirty water. School districts can send out a protective action warning over their PA systems. They can have a pre-recorded message that is launched when this alert is sent out. First responders can, for instance, have the bay doors on fire halls go up so that their trucks and equipment isn't stuck in a fire hall because they can't get the doors open after the earthquake. Other things that we can do, for instance, is put arms down on bridge so that you can get off of a bridge, but you can't get onto a bridge. Hospitals can send out alerts so surgeons can take the scalpel out of patients. And the hospitals can also use their valves to shut off their water systems to preserve their water, preserve their oxygen, and preserve their non-structural systems. Other things that we can do are bringing elevators to the ground floor. So there's a whole host of ways that we can really use ShakeAlert to automate and mitigate against the loss of some of these utilities, the water systems, gas power lines. Dams can shut down the turbines. We can clear transmission lines. So there's a lot of things that we can do with these automated systems. When it comes to how big an earthquake has to be in order to trigger these alerts, it just really depends on the method of delivery. For WIAs going to the wireless emergency alerts that go to smartphones, you know, that kind of goes to the general public. The magnitude is a 5, and the area that is alerted has an intensity of at least a 4. And so this is important to have these two different scales to use. So say we have a 5.0 underneath Salem, and we have a shaking intensity of, let's say, a 5. We don't need to alert the whole state because the whole state is not going to feel that 5 magnitude earthquake. But we do want to alert the areas that is going to have the strongest shaking. So we don't want to over alert people. We want to alert the people who need to be alerted. And so it just really depends on the thresholds that you set for these different systems. Automated interfaces have fairly low thresholds. Publicly, alerts that go out to the public have a higher threshold. So when it comes to public alerting, you know, that's another way that we can use this system. So we have the automated, and then we also have the public alerting portion of this. And there's a number of different ways that you can get this alert on your cell phone. And the first one is the wireless emergency alert. This is very similar to an Amber Alert. If you've ever gotten an Amber Alert, you're probably familiar with a text. It's just going to be a brief text. But there's also purpose-built apps. Other third-party vendors are developing apps that you can download from either the Apple iPhone store or Android Google Play. And then the Google devices, the Androids also have this hardwired or softwired into their software system. So if you have an Android OS, it's also a part of the operating system. And having these various ways to get the alert is really important because not every delivery system is going to be perfect, and you want to set up redundant systems for being able to get this alert. So you basically, if you go to your settings and make sure that your phone can receive emergency alerts, you know you're going to get the WIA, and I highly recommend that folks go to the Apple Store or Google Play and search for ShakeAlert powered apps and download those and install them on their phone, so that there's a number of different ways that you can get the alerts. So what is this alert going to look like? Well, if it is the WIA alert, it's going to be a simple text alert. It's just going to say earthquake detected, drop cover and hold on, protect yourself. Or if you've set it up for Spanish, terremoto detectado. When you have an app, it's going to look different, and then Android is also going to look different. You'll notice that it doesn't give you time to shaking because we don't have the capability in WIA to give that time to shaking. Some of the apps do provide time to shaking, but we estimate, you know, it's seconds to tens of seconds. So what can you do with seconds to 10 to seconds? That's enough time to drop cover and hold on. We want to make sure that people are responding to these events in the proper way, and that's dropping, covering, and holding on. And having a few seconds worth of warning could mean the difference between being able to get into a safe area and not being able to get into a safe area. And then, of course, if you are over on the coast, then we want you to get to high ground and to stay there. What we saw after the Japan event was that these large tsunamis can bring damaging waves for 24 to 48 hours after the main event. And then, of course, you know, aftershocks can cause their own tsunami. So if you were over on the coast, getting to high ground and staying there. So we had a question, can a subduction zone event trigger a volcano? And the answer is no, with an asterisk. If a volcano is quiescent and it's not on the precipice of erupting, no, there's not a possibility of the subduction zone causing a volcano to wake up and to erupt. If there is a volcano that is, you know, on the edge of erupting, there's a very, 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 very small chance of it happening. There's a much greater chance of having a San Andreas event about a decade later after Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. There's been some research that has shown a very strong correlation between a 9.0 earthquake on the Cascadia subduction zone and then 10 to 20 years later, a large event on the San Andreas or the Hayward Fault. So you can't go to California to get away from the Cascadia subduction zone because we will follow you there. So what do you do after the shaking stops? Well, if you're in the tsunami ground, if you're in the tsunami zone, you move to high ground by foot, and then of course you follow your emergency plan. And what this means for Oregon is that we will really have a new normal here after Cascadia, just like we have a new normal after the pandemic. You know, the COVID virus is going to be with us for a very long time. And so we have adapted our behavior to that new reality. And it's going to be the same thing for after Cascadia. You know, it's most likely that you're going to be camping in your own home without utilities. It's most likely that, you know, we're going to have disruptions to supply. We are going to have people, you know, leaving the area and never coming back. And, you know, after we saw that happened after Katrina, you know, there was a huge diaspora of folks from New Orleans, and New Orleans has not regained the population that it had prior to Katrina. And so that's, you know, that's what we're planning for, is all of our preparations in mitigation, in rebuilding our infrastructure, in getting our people prepared, getting our systems prepared. The Oregon Office of Emergency Management is working with FEMA and other state and federal agencies to get prepared for this. For instance, there's a transportation assessment going on, looking at all of the airports in Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, and pre-identifying staging grounds for materials and personnel after Cascadia. And so that report's going to be coming out fairly soon, but we know that Redmond Airport will be one of our hubs. So we will be bringing materials in probably by road from the east, staging them in Redmond, and then using either fixed wing or rotary transport to bring that over to the impacted areas in the valley and west of the Cascades. And so that material goes into predetermined areas there and then goes out to the communities to be distributed during, to the local folks through, again, predetermined locations, assuming those locations are standing. And the thing to remember is, you know, it's going to take time to get those systems up and running, because everyone that you're going to be relying on to respond to this is also going to be impacted by it. So, you know, all of the folks at OEM might not be able to get into work for a while to manage this event. You know, we will probably be cooping or, you know, going to a new location if it happens before our building is retrofitted, which is supposed to happen next year. So there's a lot of things that means it's just going to take time for us to get the structures in place, to get stuff, food, water, materials out to the public. And that's why it's really important for individuals to be ready to be on your own for at least 2 weeks. You know, as we saw last year, stuff disappears from the stores really quickly. And if we can't restock them because the transportation systems are down, then you know, having that stock of toilet paper in your garage is going to be, you know, a very wise thing to do. I don't know about you all, but every time I go to Costco, I pick up another brick of toilet paper because I remember March of last year. But the thing to remember also is that, you know, Oregonians already do a lot of the things that we're going to need to be doing to be prepared for this. You know, we camp, we hunt, we fish. A lot of those things we already do here in Oregon, and all of that will be able to help us to be better prepared. And the thing to remember is we can do this because we've seen Japan do what we need to do. Japan, in about 50 years, completely rebuilt its infrastructure so that it was able to be up and running in 2 to 3 weeks at 80 to 90% capacity. Oregon is nowhere near that because we have not to date invested in our infrastructure like we should. But you know, that's something that we can change here in Oregon, and we can do better in the future than we have in the past. So this is my contact information. Excuse me. And I would love to entertain questions.
If you have a question, go ahead and put that, either type it in the chat box or at the moment, you can speak up, unmute yourself, and then once you've asked it, remute yourself. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you, Dr. Rizzo.
Thank you. And I wanted to correct, I don't have a doctorate in geology. I have a doctorate in cultural and historical aspects of the built environment and a minor in anthropology. So I'm interested in our built environment and how humans interact with that.
Interesting. Thank you. We do have a question, and that one was asking, will the Henry Hague Lake Dam fail with a 9.0 event?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Right now, there is an evaluation of all of the dams in Oregon, whether they're publicly or privately owned. We know that a number of them will fail. So they're looking at, you know, mitigating those that are going to have a significant impact downstream. Henry Hague Lake is one of those. Also the reservoirs down in Eugene, Detroit Lake. So we do know that some of the dams will fail if it happens before we're able to mitigate them. We can't tell you which ones will, because we don't know how big the next one is going to be. But I know that they are doing a lot of assessments of those dams, and we should know more in the next few years what kind of mitigation strategies that they're going to need, whether it's a complete replacement, because a lot of these, especially privately owned dams, are earthen structures that were built before we even knew about plate tectonics, let alone the Cascadia subduction zone. So the next question is will 2 weeks worth of supplies be sufficient? And the answer is probably not. And that's why we say at least 2 weeks. And so looking at preparedness is kind of a phased thing. You know, you can get that bucket of freeze-dried foods at Costco, get one for each person in your household, stick it in your garage and forget about it. But you can also, you know, keep your pantry stocked with long-term foods. You can garden. So there's a lot of different strategies, but we definitely know that depending on where you are, 2 weeks is certainly not going to be sufficient. I know over on the coast, they say a minimum of a month to be prepared for. So the next question is, what should be done to strengthen residential buildings to avoid collapse? Well, if your home has been built since about 1990, you're probably okay. because that's when we had our seismic codes put in, and they started to address that in the building codes. Remember that building codes are only for life safety. If you want to be able to use your home, you need to build higher than the codes. So if your house was before 1990, I highly recommend that you look at having your home assessed and having it retrofitted. And generally what that means is tying the frame to the foundation, strengthening cripple walls, that's pony walls between the foundation and that first floor, and also mitigating any chimneys that you might have. So there's a lot that you can do. And sometimes these retrofits are not terribly expensive. You will spend more for granite countertops than you will on the average seismic retrofit, which is about $3,000 to $5,000. If you have a multi-story home, if you have a complicated footprint, it gets more expensive. But your standard ranch can probably be retrofitted for about $3,000 to $5,000. And most homeowners, if you're at all handy, can probably do it yourself. The next question is, different types of earthquakes produce different types of shaking, rolling versus violent. What is the characteristic of a subduction zone? So a subduction zone creates long period waves. So that means larger structures are more susceptible to damage from a subduction zone earthquake. Stick-built homes that we live in, if they're properly mitigated or properly built, actually do fairly well in these, in subduction zone earthquakes, because they can flex and bend with those long waves. It's not like the California earthquakes, which have a much shorter period for their waves, and they see a lot more damage in their single-family homes. And this does change mitigation strategies. Yes, it does, because a lot of, like I said, a lot of our built environment was built before we even knew about Cascadia, before we knew about plate tectonics. So we built very large things. We built bridges. We built the viaduct in Medford. We built very tall buildings on liquefiable soil in downtown Oregon. We built our critical energy infrastructure, the energy hub down in the port of Portland on fill, and in the 1910 to 1920s. So we know that these large structures are more susceptible to damage during Cascadia style earthquakes. And that means that we can prioritize those buildings. The CEI hub is slated to be mitigated over the next 10 to 20 years, so that we can protect our liquid fuels. Of course, you know, if we move away from a carbon-based energy system, we can, you know, increase our resilience to that kind of vulnerability of relying on liquid fuels from Washington State. So the next question is, funding for Dagami's earthquake resilience geologist was reinstated this year. Are there any discussions to how Dagami and OEM will interface, any joint projects in mind? Yeah, we work very closely with Dagami all the time. They're some of my favorite people, and I am so delighted that the legislature funded them. We were all very concerned that we would no longer have a science agency to help us mitigate. I work really closely with Dagami on tsunami issues. John Allen and I sit on the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program. We have Bob Houston and John Allen, who also sit on the Oregon State Seismic Advisory Policy Commission. So we work really closely with Dagami all the time, and they put out really good products. Some of the recent products over on the coast are what they call beat the wave maps. So you've probably all seen the tsunami evacuation maps over on the coast to let you know how far you have to go to get out of the bad zone. Well, the beat the wave maps pull in a higher level of data analysis that tells you how fast you have to be going depending on where you are, so that you can look at, for instance, the promenade in Seaside and know that you have to run from that. But if you're closer to high ground, you know, you can walk and get to high ground in time. So there's a lot of products that they're doing that help us plan our mitigation, prioritize our mitigation. And I look forward to working with them much in the future. So another question is, how far east will the quake have an effect? Some models have impact in Baker City. And the answer is, we have models that can suggest what might happen. We know that basically west of the Cascades is going to be fairly well impacted. East of the Cascade, it does start to get a lesser amount of shaking, but it just really depends on the soil. It depends on the directionality of the seismic waves. And so there's a lot that we don't know yet. If we go back to, let me pull this up. So this slide here is from the online hazards viewer called HazView. And so if you go to this website, you can type in any address and it can tell you all kinds of fun and scary things about the natural hazards in your area. And this one is shaking intensity at Hood River. And you can see that it's still very strong and severe shaking expected there. If I pulled up one for the whole state, you will see that it starts, you see more of, oops, sorry. Let me go back. The lighter greens as we go east, but like I said, there are some models that show that there could be damage in Baker City. Baker City is built of unreinforced masonry buildings, so there could be some damage there. Just a comment, imagine the mega firestorm that would infiltrate the region wide during this historic drought. Yeah, that's kind of our emergency manager's worst nightmare, is if this happened during fire season or flood season or ice storm season, or any of the other seasons that we're starting to have here in Oregon for different types of natural hazards that we didn't see as much of 10 to 20 years ago. We're starting to see more tornadoes here in Oregon, whereas they, used to be very rare. Now we have several a year. Climate change is definitely going to be impacting our ability to be resilient from these large earthquakes.
May I ask a question?
Oh, absolutely.
Dr. Rizzo? Yeah, this is Joe. In regards to this map that you showed here, how do you determine how severe an earthquake would be in regards to your area? Does it depend on what is a hard soil, rock soil? Is it safer than soft soil? Or how do you determine all that stuff?
Yeah, so this map is from Dogami, and this is based on their maps and models. So this takes into account the geology of the area. So are you, like you said, on hard soil or hard rock, or if you are on river soil, or if it takes that into consideration, and then the models can produce expected shaking intensity from that.
So does it mean a hard rock would be safer than soft rocks because it would be more in motion when an earthquake occurs?
Yes, if you can build on basalt and really anchor that home to that basalt, you will be much better than if you are, on alluvial fill or man-made land.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Appreciate it.
And yeah, no problem. So there are areas that are susceptible to more shaking. For instance, if you have a great big bowl of basalt, which Oregon is basically a big bowl, a big basalt bowl, and then you have softer soils inside of that. You can kind of get a bathtub effect. So within that bowl, the shaking intensity can actually be much higher than the surrounding areas. And so you can kind of see that reflected here on the map, where you have softer soils that can amplify the shaking intensity. So this online viewer has liquefaction, it has earthquakes, it also has crustal faults that you can turn off and on. I know that when we were looking at purchasing our house, I took a big map of the city, and then I got the flood map, and then I used HazView to map all the local faults, and I had it map the Cascadia expected shaking. And so we ended up with like a 10 block area that we were looking at to buy a home in, because, you know, an emergency manager. So I think about all the bad things that could possibly happen. So another question is what's the likely impact of residents of the West Hills of Portland? I think that you can expect to see a lot of landslides in that area. The area is already prone to landslides. So you're going to see a lot of co-seismic landslides. And, you know, this is another place where those aftershocks can be very impactful. So if you don't have a landslide in that first main shock, aftershocks can also cause landslides. So we are expecting tens of thousands of landslides after Cascadia if it's a 9.0 earthquake.
Any other questions? Well, you have covered a lot tonight. Thank you so very, very much.
Yeah, I again appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you guys.
One other question here. Have any bridges been reinforced across the Willamette?
Yes, so the new TriMet bridge has been reinforced. There is a current project going for the Burnside Bridge. I believe that it's been a while since I've thought about the Portland bridges. Selwood Bridge. I think that there's a plan to either replace it or it has been replaced. But the
Markham Bridge has been
reinforced.
Markham Bridge has been reinforced, right? Didn't they do this like 10, 15 years ago?
It's not where it needs to be to withstand a 9.0 earthquake.
Yeah.
But there are probably going to be one or two bridges across the Willamette standing after this.
Selwood is supposed to be earthquake resistant.
Pardon?
The Selwood Bridge is supposed to be earthquake resistant.
Yeah, I think that I can't remember if they retrofitted it or replaced it. But
it was replaced with a bridge that's supposedly built right.
Yeah. So I think it's the Selwood, the Burnside when it's completed, the transit bridge. Those are the three that will probably survive. But that doesn't mean they're going to let you across it anytime soon. So if you work on one side of the bridge and live on the other, make plans. If you have kids or grandkids on one side of the bridge and you're on the other, make plans. Because it could be a while before you get across. I remember when I was living up in Portland, I lived out in Lentz and I worked at OHSU. And we had one of those snowstorms. And I ended up walking from OHSU out to where my kids were at Ankeny Elementary School, and then we all walked out to Lentz because it was faster than trying to drive and safer than trying to drive. So, you know, it doesn't take a very large earthquake to need to have some preparedness and contingency plans. So another question was, any bridges down the Willamette Valley? And the answer is yes. I mean, if a bridge has not been retrofitted, it will most likely be unusable, if not completely destroyed after Cascadia. And so that means, you know, the Willamette Valley is going to cut the valley in two for most places, and we'll need to think about ferries or, you know, pontoon bridges. But, you know, crossing across the Willamette will be very problematic for a long time. So have I brought you enough joy and happiness for the evening? And the important thing is to remember that all of our problems can be mitigated for the most part. You know, it just takes time, it takes effort, and it takes the public pushing policymakers to get that ball rolling. Our legislature has been very responsive to this. Oregon has a very robust school seismic retrofit program so that our schools are slowly being retrofitted, and our hospitals and our first responders. So, you know, we are moving in the right direction. It just, you know, it just takes time because we don't have an unlimited amount of money to go fix everything at once. So the question was, how likely are the retrofits going to survive a 9.0? And the likelihood is very good because they are engineered to survive that. We may not be able to use those buildings or that infrastructure afterwards, but it won't collapse if it's been retrofitted. We need to be doing more like what Utah has done and spending the money and base isolating our important buildings, our hospitals, our, you know, our civic infrastructure. But we'll get there. It's just a matter of time that I hope we have.
Well, this is Larry McClure again, Althea. Thanks so much. This is why we study history, to learn from the past, to predict the future. So we really appreciate your time tonight. And now you have to worry with your colleagues about wildfires at the moment, but it's good to know that there are other things to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
Thanks
Thank you
again.
all so much.
Thank you again. Very excellent program.